about towards a sustainable, just, and efficient distribution of resources. Josh is another person with an eclectic ecological economics background. He has a bachelor's degree in biology from Vermont, and then he has a master's degree from Columbia in international public affairs, and he has a PhD from Cornell in economics. So again, someone who's had both natural science, social science backgrounds, and we'll try to synthesize and integrate all of that experience and tell us about distribution of resources today. Thanks. Oh, and again, what we'll do with the questioning, if you weren't here for the previous two talks, the coordinators of the questions here will pass out some papers, and if you have questions, write those down and pass them to the aisles. And at the end, they will synthesize those questions, make sure that if there's several people asking the same question, it only gets asked once. And they will also be synthesizing questions that came from students taking this seminar for credit that were submitted over the web earlier, and they'll be asking the questions at the end. And we'll go till about 1:15 with the talk, and then we'll have about 30 minutes after that for questions and discussion. Okay, Josh.
All right. First of all, I gave a reading. This was done on fairly short notice. I gave a reading that's way too long, needed 15 pages edited out, and it was the result of a workshop where we tried to we had certain questions to ask, and we all worked in a group to answer them and tried to incorporate all of that into one paper. So it's more of the shotgun approach than the concise argument. But I'm not actually going to follow that paper exactly. That's more of a complement to this talk than this talk certainly won't repeat that. I'll move on from there, talk about some other issues. And first of all, I guess just to give you a quick outline of how it's going to go, most economists leave the distribution question up to politicians or philosophers. They don't really tackle it. Ecological economics considers distribution a key issue. So I want to briefly explain why distribution is such an important issue in ecological economics. Very briefly talk about the link between distribution and sustainability, the link between distribution and efficiency, and then just show what's the existing distribution of wealth and income in the United States and globally, and why people think that redistribution is such a complicated issue, why a lot of politicians shy away from it, why a lot of economists shy away from it, and the conventional view of the problems with redistribution, and the current trends in redistribution. What's happening right now in the United States with redistribution of resources? And not just the United States, but globally. And then finally, building on that to put some steps towards what I would consider to be a sustainable, just, and efficient distribution of resources. And there's some of this stuff I'll basically be presenting the general ideas and very briefly introducing kind of the technical work behind it, because these aren't just generalities. These are essentially building on economic principles to show why distribution is not just a moral issue, but is also relates to efficiency and plays a very important role in economics. So to begin with, a brief introduction to ecological economics. I know you've already had a couple of lectures on the topic. I don't need to go into much detail. I just want to draw out the links here why the distribution issue is so important. But before you can talk about anything being important, you need to have some kind of objective function. You need to have some goal in mind. So the definition of economics is, people generally agree, or certainly one of the widespread definitions, is that economics is the science of the allocation of scarce resources towards alternative desirable ends. We have a certain amount of resources, we want to achieve certain ends, and we want to do that efficiently, use those resources to get our ends as efficiently as possible. So the first question any economist needs to ask is, what are the desirable ends? What is it we're trying to achieve? You can't assess the efficiency of anything until you've decided on what it is you're trying to achieve. And so what I'm going to propose, just as a very quick, general, vague definition of the desirable ends, it's the highest possible quality of life for this and future generations. And that's quite a bit of what the paper I talked about was what quality of life is. And I would argue that quality of life is a hell of a lot more than just what we consume. It's not just measured by material consumption. There's a whole array of things that add to our quality of life. One of the big issues is The goods, essentially the ecosystem services provided by nature, they include life support functions of the planet. You have no quality of life without those services. And so we really have to look at how all of these things fit into our economic system. So then the question is, once we've asked this question, what is it we want to achieve? What are the desirable ends? We have to look at what are the scarce resources. And I'm really quickly going to review, that leads into the pre-analytic vision of ecological economics, which I missed the first presentation, but I imagine this was discussed, that ecological economics looks at, we have a finite planet, and the laws of thermodynamics apply. You can't create something from nothing. Every single thing the economic system creates comes from raw materials provided by nature. You also can't create nothing from something. Everything the economic system creates returns to nature as waste, because the second law of thermodynamics says things tend towards greater disorder. So every economic act has two impacts on the ecosystem that sustains it. You are removing the components, the raw materials, and that degrades the ability of the ecosystem to provide us with these ecosystem services, these life support functions, and you're spewing waste out into the environment, and that further degrades the ability of the ecosystem to provide these goods and services. So the scarce resource fundamentally is low entropy matter energy, and economic growth displaces ecosystem function. And what's happened is as our economy has grown, it hasn't grown into a void, it's grown into the sustaining global ecosystem. It's displaced those ecosystem functions. So what has become the scarce resource is now the ecosystem services and the raw materials provided by nature. And that's a big change from what conditions were 200 years ago. So and I'm sure I imagine this is all review. So because of that, because this idea we live on a finite planet, the most important question in ecological economics is sustainable scale. And that's how big the economic system can get relative to the global ecosystem. And that's a scientific question. You need input from ecologists. You need input from all the different disciplines and to find out what it is that, what the carrying capacity is. And it's a very difficult question. And it's a question that can't be answered using standard science. The traditional technique in science is you have repeatable experiments. We're dealing with a sample size of 1. You can't have repeatable experiments on the carrying capacity of the planet Earth. You can have 1 experiment. And so it's a scientific question, but it can't be answered using traditional scientific techniques. And so ecological economics says sustainable scale is the first question, just distribution is the second issue. This is an ethical question, and it flows directly from the idea of sustainable scale. If the economy can't physically grow forever and ever and ever. Right now, when we look at the issue of poverty, the politicians say the best answer to poverty is we will grow our way out of it. The economy will get bigger, we'll have a bigger pie, and therefore everybody will have a big enough slice of that pie to survive. As soon as you start arguing that a finite planet can't sustain infinite growth, you're saying that either we're going to stop growing, but then we have people in desperate poverty today. One of the reasons we argue that we're going to stop growing is to make sure that future generations have enough. And it's a pretty bizarre ethical system that would allow us to be more concerned about future generations and their well-being than the poor people alive today. So as soon as you start saying that the economic system can't grow forever, you're forced to tackle this idea of just distribution, who gets what. And the final issue is, if economic growth has to stop for the well-being of future generations, we certainly can't ask people who don't have enough to survive today to sacrifice for the future. So the basic argument is that just distribution is an ethical issue. Scale is a question of science. Just distribution is a question of ethics. And I'm going to go a little beyond there. I'm going to argue that it's more than a question of ethics. So once you've settled on sustainable scale and determined a just distribution, then ecological economists say you can tackle the issue of efficient allocation. Efficient allocation is the main issue for most economists. And ecological economists put it third. First of all, what efficient allocation is how do we take what we have and create the most desirable outcomes from it? We have a certain finite amount of goods and materials provided by the planet Earth. We want to create the greatest amount of quality of life, the greatest amount of well-being for people, and from the given amount of goods. So that's the efficient question, the efficiency question. ecological economists say, well, until you've determined the question of scale, how much resources are available for the economy to allocate, how many resources need to be left for the ecosystem to function and provide us with these life support functions, you got to answer the question of how much there is available to allocate before you can look at how we allocate it. So scale has to be first. But then once you've determined scale, economists say that we have this concept of Pareto efficiency, which I'm not going to go into explain in great detail, but basically it's a way of coming at this, you can show mathematically that if a market economy will distribute resources so that nobody can be made better off without making anybody else worse off. And this is considered an objective scientific standard of efficiency. So the argument is that economics is a value-neutral science because it uses this scientific criteria of Pareto efficiency to allocate resources most efficiently. And that's so that most economists will say that economics is value-neutral. It's science, it's not ethics. But there's a big but here. And one of these things is when we decide how to, under this market allocation, this Pareto efficiency, when we decide what the desirable ends are, all those desirable ends are weighted by how much money you have. So when you're voicing your preferences for what the desirable ends are for society, your vote is weighted by your income and or your wealth. And that is a very value-laden assumption, that the desirable ends, where we should go, how our planet should allocate its resources, is the answer is given by how much money you have. You have more weight. So that's a huge ethical assumption. And what it means, and even economists recognize this, is that every different distribution you start out with leads to a different efficient outcome. So the desirability of the efficient outcome can be no greater than the desirability of the initial distribution. So if your initial distribution is not considered desirable, then your efficient outcome is also not desirable. So again, we're moving away from this idea of efficiency is science and economics is a value-neutral science towards this idea where there are some serious ethical questions we've got to answer. And distribution, and this is why ecological economists put distribution before efficiency, because your efficient outcome is going to be entirely different depending on what distribution you decide is desirable. And so it really is an ethical question, not just a scientific question. So now we're going to go, so that's basically the background, ecological economics, and why distribution is an important issue. And very quickly, I just want to touch on how distribution relates to the idea of sustainability. And there's two types of things. A lot of people say the reason that rainforests are being chopped down, the reason our coral reefs are being overfished is because poor people need to make money today. They can't be concerned about the future. If a Somalian farmer has some corn and he's starving, he could plant that corn and get enormous returns in 2 months, but he's going to eat it now. He doesn't care about the future. He's got to survive now. These poor people who are dynamiting coral reefs or who are chopping down forests on terrible soils for a few years of crops, they can't care about the future because they've just got to think about filling their bellies today. So poverty is not compatible with sustainability. But way more important than that is that the richest people in the world today consume the vast majority of the world's resources. The United States consumes 25% of the world's resources. As we say, if you accept the principles of ecological economics, you can't make something from nothing, and that resources, the raw materials of ecosystems, not only are the raw materials that create things in our economy, but left intact in the ecosystem, they provide this suite of ecosystem services, the climate regulation, the ozone layer, the biodiversity that allows the whole system to persist, the cleansing of water, et cetera, is you remove ecosystem structure to create your economic goods, you're wiping out the capacity of the ecosystem to generate these life support functions. So wealthy people, by consuming 25% of the Earth's resources just in the United States, are depleting the capacity of the ecosystem to provide these sustainable future. And they're also spewing forth waste that further do that. So it's the poor, to some extent, don't care about the future, and therefore poverty is not compatible with sustainability, but more so the extreme rich deplete the resources that are required for sustainability. So there is a very strong link between distribution and sustainability. And before I talked about this efficiency, the idea that it's an objective science and distribution that's moral, ethical values, but there's a strong link between distribution and efficiency. And here's the thing that anybody who's had a course in economics knows. They talk about diminishing marginal utility. The more you have of something, the less an additional unit is worth. Your 5th slice of pizza is less satisfying than your 1st slice of pizza. Your 5,000th pair of shoes, if you're Imelda Marcos, is less satisfying than your first pair. But the same thing applies. $1,000 to Bill Gates has a lot less value than $1,000 to a person who can't put food on the table. There's this, there's just no question that that extra money required to get somebody above the subsistence level has way more value than those extra resources going to somebody who's just so fabulously well-to-do they wouldn't know if they had them. So this is the basic principle of mainstream economics, diminishing marginal utility, and yet economists say that distribution is a question of ethics left for the politicians and not of efficiency, whereas if your goal is to improve the quality of life, then transferring resources from the fabulously well-to-do to the people who aren't meeting their basic needs, those people who aren't meeting their basic needs are going to get a lot more utility, a lot more quality of life from the same amount of resources than somebody who's fabulously well-to-do. And that's a really basic point that economists have decided they're going to ignore. I wouldn't say all economists, but they decided they're going to ignore because a couple of very aristocratic economists at the start of this century made the argument that you can't compare well-being between people. I can't say that my having enough money to stave off malnutrition and death from exposure benefits me any more than Bill Gates having that same extra couple $100, because you can't compare well-being between people. We can't say that I suffer more from breaking my leg than you suffer from stubbing your toe. And I would argue that that's actually a fairly silly assumption, that it seems very clear that if our goal, if the objective of economics is to improve the quality of life, then redistributing resources from those who have so much they wouldn't notice the loss to those who don't have enough to meet their basic needs is going to improve the quality of life with the same amount of resources. So therefore, distribution is intimately connected to efficiency, although they try to toss that out in a lot of mainstream economics. I would also say that there's a lot of negative externalities associated with unequal distribution. Last week's talk, Richard Howarth talked about how people compare their well-being according to their relative wealth. You think of yourself as well-off relative to how much, not just how much money you have absolutely, but how much money other people have. That means that a lot of people get a lot more money and you stay the same, you feel worse. So that there's a negative externality associated with poor distribution of resources that, and I think that was fairly well explained in last week's talk. That, he called it relative wealth. I'm not sure if he called it positional wealth, same idea. But that you feel worse off as others become well off. And also, they've shown that in societies, more than the absolute level of income, your relative level of income affects your physical health. And they've done studies, what they suggest is that people who have less wealth have lower status. Lower status is associated with less respect, more stress. Stress has impacts on your health. They've done studies in baboon societies that show the lowest on the totem pole, regardless of their nutritional intake, are less healthy, and it has to do with the stress. You remove the top actors so that somebody moves up in the hierarchy and they attain better health. And the same thing happens in our societies, that in the societies with very unequal distribution of wealth, you have a lot worse health outcomes. So some people having a lot of wealth and a lot of status has a negative impact on other people. This is a negative externality, and economists recognize negative externalities are inefficient. So this is just some of the ideas why distribution can lead to inefficiencies. And then again, and this is the biggie, every time, wealth is not worth anything unless you're consuming. I mean, you can either translate wealth into power or consumption. If you're consuming more, you're using your greater wealth to consume more, that means you are using up more raw materials from the environment. If they're renewable resource, biological resources, when you take those away from the environment, you're depleting the capacity of the ecosystem to function. If you're using non-renewable resources, to some extent you deplete the capacity of the ecosystem to function when you remove them, but more important, when you spew the waste out, when you burn the oil, when you have the the organochlorines going out, when you have the heavy metals going out, you are having massive negative impacts on the environment. And what's happening here is the ecosystem services, these functions of intact ecosystems, they're what you call public goods. Nobody owns them. One person using them doesn't wear them out. They benefit everybody equally. You know, everybody benefits from a stable climate. If I use that stable climate to grow crops, I don't leave any less of that stable climate for somebody else. If I use the ozone layer to protect me from skin cancer, there's just as much left for anybody else. I can't stop anybody from using it. So these ecosystem services in general benefit everybody. When we convert those ecosystem services to private goods, they benefit the private individual. So this idea of if you have some people who have a capacity to consume a huge amount, they are systematically converting benefits that go to everybody to benefits that go to the individual. And that's another massive negative externality, another massive inefficiency, and something that's not very well dealt with by our economic system. So, so what a lot of economists say is, like, let's not worry about it, because we've shown that as resources become scarce, prices go up, we develop substitutes, and so there's really no limit to resources anyway. But the resources I'm talking about here, the whole point is they have no price. They're public goods, there's no price, they're not bought and sold. There is no signal that says they're becoming scarcer for the market to respond to. There is no incentive to develop substitutes. So these are types of goods that when we wipe them out, they're gone, and within the market system, there'll be no incentive to create substitutes. I don't know if I'm going too fast. I'm throwing out a lot of ideas here. But probably not going fast enough, actually. So one last thing I want to talk about. This is also related to distribution and efficiency, but it's distribution and democracy. And what happens, I think it's very obvious in our society that those people who have money are able to translate that money into political power. That political power they then use, they manipulate the political system to create an unequal playing field that returns more of the benefits of the economy to them. So right now, you know, there's all these massive tax breaks being proposed for the rich, tax breaks for corporations. And as it stands right now, corporations actually get way more welfare, way more subsidies from the government than poor people do. And that seems pretty clearly a case where people have taken their economic power, turned it into political power, and used that to tilt the playing field to give them more economic power. I think the classic example, of course, is that most corporations nowadays donate to both sides in a political race because they want to have leverage. Not that they care one side wins or other, they want to have leverage. And economists refer to this. When you're spending money to manipulate the system to get more benefits for yourself, that's inefficient. It's what they call rent-seeking behavior. So you're actually, it's a source of real inefficiency, and a lot of people are fairly comfortable with the idea that wealth is distributed unequally in society. But in a democracy, fewer people are comfortable with the idea that power should be distributed unequally. Just because you're good at making money in no way says that you should therefore have more ability to make laws. You know, that the two should be separate spheres. But the truth is, when we have unequal distribution of economic power, it turns into unequal distribution of political power, and that's used to create distortions in the economy that make it less efficient. And I think the great quote is this one here is, you know, we can have a democratic society or we can have unlimited concentration of wealth, but we can't have both. And that was Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. And I don't think you can say it much better than that. And ironically, Americans have two dreams. We want to become fabulously well-to-do, and we want to live in a democracy. And they're incompatible. So now we've looked at some of the issues here of, you know, just kind of looking theoretically at some of the issues of distribution and how it affects efficiency, sustainability, why it's important. So this is just some data on the existing distribution of wealth in the USA. And I'm not sure how well you can see it, but the bottom line is the wealth of the poorest 80% of the population. The next line up is the wealth of the top 1%. So, I mean, 80 times more people in that bottom line than the next line up, and then the very top line is the 19% in between. But you can see, I mean, there's an incredibly skewed distribution of wealth, and that's not the main point to draw to this graph, but the trend. That the poorest people, their share of the wealth is going down, the very richest people, their share is going up, and the middle, well, not the middle portion, but it's still the upper quintile, they're going down a little bit. But what we're having here is a very dramatic redistribution of resources from the poor to the rich. Or it's actually a redistribution, I should say, it's of the new wealth. Far more of it is going to the poor, I mean, to the rich than the poor. But that's wealth. So wealth is one component, but there's also a distribution of income. And actually, if you looked at, if I had a similar graph to this on income, you'd find that the 80% of the poorest have more income. But what you'd want to do is you'd want to break down the distribution of income according to not just 1%, 19%, 80%. This is just kind of a income distribution across the United States. So the mode, most people make about this much, which I think it's the, or most families, the mode for families is probably in your 20,000s. The mean, the average family makes about, I think it's like 49,000 or something like that. But if you wanted to have this graph encompass the richest people who are out there, you would have to extend this screen 10,000 times approximately to get the people like Bill Gates. It would probably, I'm not sure it'd still be in the same state. I guess it would be. But it's, so when you see a graph like this, I mean, they truncate it at about $100,000 off and say $100,000 and above, but that $100,000 and above extends a ridiculously long distance. I mean, Bill Gates, I don't know if he makes $1 billion a year, but that would be a factor of, a factor of 4, 10,000 times greater. So, so the distribution of income within the United States is pretty bad. But the fact of the matter is, international distribution of income is so much worse than what happens within the United States. The United States is the worst distribution of the developed countries, but compared to a lot of the Latin America, a lot of Africa, we have fantastically equal distribution of income. And if you compare the richest in our country to the poorest in other countries, then you also find just an amazing difference that makes what the distributions I showed pale in comparison. I used some World Bank data to just to get some idea of what's happening in global income trends. I was looking at the issue of globalization and a lot of the countries that have really opened up their markets to globalization in sub-Saharan Africa, what's happened. I looked at the 15 poorest countries in the world, excluding those that are in war. I figured war, that's obviously going to lower your income anyway. So taking out the 15 poorest countries not in war, over the last 10 years, they had an absolute decline in income. So not a decline in relative income, but a decline in real income. So less able to meet their basic needs. And these are countries that, and when I'm calculating this decline in income, it's monetary. It's ignoring the fact they've mined their minerals, chopped down their forests, depleted their soils. So their real wealth has actually suffered a much greater decline than this would show. And all those countries were very much opened up to international trade. That's a separate topic I won't go into today. The 15 richest countries in the world experienced 15.5% growth. So the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And just to give you some comparison, and this is all based on World Bank statistics, 1% of, if the United States took 1% of its economic growth and redistributed it towards the 24 poorest countries in the world, it would double their GNPs. So just to give you some idea of how skewed distribution is. And the reason this, as I say, the reason this matters is because we do live on a finite planet. Our consumption of resources means there is that much less for other people to consume. All right, so I gotta. Oh, one other thing. So there's actually no theory in economics why wealth is distributed as it is among individuals. Seems a lot of it's inheritance, a lot of it's luck, and a lot of it is your basic abilities, although less is basic ability than inheritance probably. But there are theories for how things are distributed by factors of production. And the idea is that as a laborer, I will be paid just as much as the last hour of work I contribute adds to the product. So essentially, I'm paid for what I produce, roughly speaking. So labor, therefore, is awarded 70% of the income in the country because theoretically it contributes about 70% of the output. Profit, so wages are the return to labor. Profit is the return to capital and entrepreneurship. That gets about 20%. Interest is the return to financial capital, gets about 8%. And rent is the return to land and theoretically natural capital, I would guess. Saying here, this is how we look at the statistics, that contributes 2%. Ecological economists are here telling you that you can't produce something from nothing. All value ultimately comes from the low entropy resources provided by nature, and yet when we divide up by the factors of production, we're arguing that nature produces virtually nothing. So that seems to be a little bit of a, that seems a little fishy. And most people would argue that natural resources do contribute to production. What I will be arguing when I talk about redistribution and efficient approaches to redistribution, I will say yes, rent as returns to land and labor, it contributes an awful lot, but most of it goes into the categories of profit and wages. We ignore its contribution, and that's what I'll be talking about a little bit more in a minute. So now I want to get at, before I talk about how we can and should redistribute resources, what's the conventional view? First of all, people are entitled to keep what they earn with the sweat of their brows. If I work hard for something, damn it, I'm entitled to that. Why should I give away what I earn? And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying that makes sense. Another thing is if you redistribute, if I take away what somebody has earned, well, then they're going to have a lot less incentive to work hard. And if they're not going to work hard, they're going to produce less. There'll be less overall for the economy. A lot of people argue that it's the wealthy who work hard, create jobs, provide the jobs for everybody else. As soon as you start taking away what people earn, they're not going to work very hard, and there's going to be a smaller pie. And the poor will be worse off. There'll be fewer jobs. The poor will be worse off. And and there's a grain of truth in that as well. And the other thing is that when you want to redistribute money, you got to get that money somehow. And most of the time, whatever you tax, whatever you try to get money from, economists tell you it distorts incentives and economic, prices no longer serve balance supply and demand. You don't get these beautifully efficient outcomes. So these essentially are the three reasons that a lot of people are opposed to any type of redistribution. So now I want to look at what is currently happening with redistribution. And what I'm going to argue is that there's massive amounts of redistribution going on, and what it is essentially is an enclosure of the commons. That we're redistributing resources that belong to everybody, and we're rewarding them to the few. And the enclosure of the commons, for those who know, I guess about 200 years ago in England, they decided that there was a big issue. They were trying to develop markets in labor, and you had all these people on the land, and what the lords did, the nobility captured the land for themselves. And instead of supporting the peasants, it raised wool for the mills, and all the peasants were dislocated. They became the pool of labor. But it was a big issue. It was essentially something, the nobility taking what had belonged to the poor, they captured it for themselves. So the Commonwealth used to be this term. Okay, what is the Commonwealth? The Commonwealth is, people don't talk about the Commonwealth anymore, and it's something that really has to come back into our language. So I would argue the Commonwealth is what belongs to society, what belongs to everybody, and it's the values produced by nature, which includes non-renewable resources, renewable resources, airwaves, etc. All these things, these are values produced by nature. There is no special entrepreneurial power of the corporations that grab those profits, that grab those resources. There's nothing special about those corporations. This is value produced by nature. They're just managing to capture it. And also the values produced by society. And one thing, private property is an institution of society. There is no private property without institutions that defend it. Without government supporting the right to private property, it's might makes right. It's you own what you can defend by yourself. So private property is a value produced by society, and it makes sense, therefore, that those who have more private property should be willing to cover more of the costs of providing that private property, and therefore covering more of the cost of running society. Another value produced by society is land. And why is that a value produced by society, not by nature? Well, nature produced the land, but it's society that gives that land value. If you bought land here in Burlington 60 years ago and didn't do another thing to it, just left it alone, left it vacant, it would be worth a fortune right now. I have a friend in New York, or he lives outside of New York City, bought a house 5 years ago for $350,000. They built a train that connected his neighborhood to New York City. He sold his house for $850,000, made $100,000 a year in profit, not because he did anything to that house or that property, but because society, because the government put in that line, of that train line. The same in London. They put in a new extension of the underground, and they figured that added $13 billion to property values. So the value in land is created by what society does, not by what the individual does. Another thing is knowledge and information. So basically, you know, there's a lot of individual effort that goes into creating knowledge and information, but there's also, you know, a store of cultural knowledge and information that everything, you know, anytime anybody creates something new, they're standing on the shoulders of giants, they're adding a tiny little fraction to that value, then they put a patent on it and capture the whole thing. And I kind of got to go fast. I wanted to talk a little bit more about that right now. You know, the Constitution says that you can award property rights, individual property rights to knowledge if it will enhance the creation of culture and science. Just this year, they extended property rights, copyright, to life plus 70 years for individuals and to 95 years for corporations. And most people have a significant decrease in productivity after they're dead. So extending property rights 70 years after somebody is dead is not adding a lot to the well-being of society. It happened to be that Mickey Mouse was nearing 75 and was going to lose his copyright, so we transferred some of this wealth of the Disney Corporation to political power and extended copyrights. Another value produced by society is money. That, you know, money is, and I'll get to that if I have time, because I do want to cover a few more things in the next 5 minutes. But money is worth nothing, and you know, as it says on the bill, in God we trust, it's really in government we trust. They're the ones printing the money. Society creates the money. It has no inherent value of itself. So I'll try to get to that. So what's happening, though, in all of these things, all of these areas, we are giving, you can get non-renewable resources. If you're a big corporation, you discover minerals on some land, you pay the government $2.50 an acre for that land, and it's yours. Massive transfer of national wealth to the individual sector. Renewable resources. Right now, the government builds roads into our national forests and sells the rights to the timber for less than it costs to build the roads. We're giving away our forests. Airwaves, orbits, et cetera, we have given those away. It used to be that if you had a TV station where you got the right to use an airwave, you had to provide a public service in return. Ronald Reagan changed that. Now it's just a direct giveaway to the corporation of the Commonwealth. And again, for private property, land, knowledge and information, all these things, you know, the patent laws, now they're patenting everything, and we're extending patent protection globally. So more and more, we're taking the values produced by society and giving them to the individuals. So very quickly, now that I've left myself only 4 minutes, I want to look towards policies towards a sustainable, just, and efficient distribution of resources. And there's some basic principles, and this at least I think we should capture, that people do have the right to keep what they earn with the sweat of their brows. But the point is that much of what people do capture is not earned with the sweat of their brows. They're capturing wealth created by nature and society, and that wealth should belong to nature, should belong to society and be distributed far more equally. And that might not be enough to achieve all the goals you want, but it's a great starting place, and it's not going to provide any of these disincentives that a lot of people talk about redistribution does. And another little corollary to that, I would say, is that when you're allowing an individual to capture a public good, you might make them pay for the destruction of the public good, but that should be returned to society as another public good. And we don't have time to really expand on that right now. Another thing is, if unequal distribution creates negative externalities, those negative externalities should be internalized. If your actions are causing negative impacts on others, you should pay for those negative impacts. You should compensate society for the negative impacts. And that's a bit about what Rich Howarth talked about last week with this 50% marginal tax on consumption. That's the exact same principle. And then finally, those who benefit most from the government services pay the most. And as we talked about, one of the most important services of government is the protection of private property. Those who have the most private property have the most to gain from government, therefore should be covering more of the costs of government. And the last little bit, I want to show some of the, define a little bit more accurately and carefully what this means in economic terms, and you can actually use mainstream economics to show what money should be captured. In terms of natural resources, what we want to do is capture the rent for society, and even, essentially have that as an option for redistributing income. The definition of rent in economic terms is unearned income. It's been recognized for hundreds of years that the income from land rent is unearned. So there's land, has rent that should be captured. Non-renewable resources have what they call a user cost. That's essentially their value in the ground, the value they have independent of what any corporations, any expenditures the corporations have on extracting those values. And renewable resources have what I would call a natural dividend. They have this capacity to reproduce, and that there's a certain profit to be made there, a value produced by nature. And I'll see if I have a little bit of time to cover. Well, actually, maybe I'm going to try to, I guess, since I only have a couple minutes, I do apologize. I was hoping I could have kept this little intro a bit shorter. But those are the principles. People ask me any more questions on them, I can have the more detailed answers. But those are the principles for distribution of natural resources. And I do have a little information on land taxes if anybody wants to know, of capturing the user cost of non-renewables. And one thing I'd like to say is that capturing this user cost from non-renewables, the scarcity rent, the royalties, it's not some wild, radical idea. It's something that's actually being done right now by Alaska, which coincidentally is the only state in the union that had an improvement in distribution of wealth over the last 10 years. What they do is say the oil belongs to Alaskans. It doesn't belong to the corporations. Therefore, when a corporation extracts that oil, they have to pay Alaskans for the right. The money goes into a fund, and the fund gains interest, and the interest is distributed to the Alaskans. And the idea here, as you can see, is the amount of oil, which is the solid area, is depleted. The permanent fund is what they call it, increases, and the dividends paid out of that permanent fund increase, so that what you're essentially doing is replacing a flow of oil with a flow of returns on your investments, and it goes to the Alaskans and not the corporations. And my time is up, so I just want to really quickly point out there is, you can show, yeah, I guess it would take a few minutes to explain this, this graph. I wasn't going to explain the whole thing. I was going to give the briefest summary of what it means. But the basic point, too, is that ecosystem services are inevitably destroyed by any economic activity. And who owns those ecosystem services? Who owns the life support functions of the planet? Does that belong to the owners of the forest, or does that belong to society? And we can question ownership, and we have questioned ownership in the past. And you can essentially, there's a few things about tax. You can tax damage to ecosystem services and use that money. And just one last thing that'll take about a minute is this idea. Right now, most people don't realize how money is created. But what happens as your economy expands, you actually need more money to chase the goods and services that are available. That money's got to come from somewhere. Governments can actually print that money and spend it into existence, and so essentially, it's the government that creates the institutions, the structure, the stability that gives money value. In a lot of societies, governments will actually create money, spend it into existence. And that's called seigniorage, over seigneur from lord, the only person who had the right to do that. In our society, what we've done is to some extent the government does that, but largely the government gives the banks the right to loan money into existence. And this is kind of a difficult concept, but I just want to say that there's a big question of who should get the money. When the banks loan money into existence, they capture the interest rates, the interest on that money. They get a profit. They divide that a little bit with the people who have enough money to invest in the banks, because you got to coax your investors to go to you. The question is, who should get the rights to seigniorage? It's a value created by society. And just very quickly, I want to talk about Ithaca hours is like Burlington bread. It's a local currency. If you agree to accept Ithaca hours, you become part of the Ithaca hours economy. Well, you are adding to the production of goods and services that the Ithaca hours are out there purchasing. So more money is needed to purchase those goods and services you are contributing. So how does Ithaca hours create that money? If you agree to accept Ithaca hours for your goods and services, they give you money. They give you the equivalent of $20 US. Not a lot, but the idea is that you will be contributing goods and services. More money is needed to chase those, therefore they give you money. They also give grants directly to people in the community. They give interest-free loans and they give grants. So essentially, that would be a possibility for the US government. Instead of allowing governments to lend money into existence, you can give governments the power to loan money into existence for all sorts of activities that contribute to the public good and not just ones that make profits. And actually, that's all I have time to get at, and I do apologize for being very quick at the end. I'm never very good at timing. But I was just going to summarize some of those things. So, but I think all right, just very quickly, that distribution is a moral issue, but it's also relevant to efficient allocation. I think that's a big point. Some points from the chapter is that, and this is the kind of idea I wanted to get across from the chapter that I assigned, is that there's a lot of ways that more equal distribution of resources improves the well-being of this generation and future generations. The big question right now is when people look at sustainability, they think, oh my God, I don't want to sacrifice for the future. If you look at value as more than just material goods, but all the things that contribute to human well-being, you find that a more equal distribution of resources gives us more time to pursue these other things of value. And that stuff comes out of the chapter. But finally, I mean, the basic point is that economists say distribution is the realm of ethicists and politicians, but no, it's the realm of economics. And not tackling that issue, I say, is shirking your duty as an economist. So that's.
So we have our coordinators here. If you can pass your questions over to the aisles, I guess, that direction. We'll select those, and we're going to start with some questions that come from the students. So email first, and then get to the audience questions. And we have about another 25 minutes or so. Questions.
In my defense, I was thinking it was an hour-long, or hour and a half class. I was planning for an hour presentation.
This is a question from the reading, and about a third of our respondents had something along this lines. Do you think that our society will develop a fair economic system on its own, or is it destined to boil down to a more violent approach, much like the French Revolution, to set the country on the right path?
I would say that in our society right now, the wealth has an undue share of the power. We have a society, essentially, you could look at three pillars of power. The government has power, the business has power, and the people have power. Most people in our country have chosen not to vote. We have abdicated our power. To fill that vacuum, business has stepped in. But I would say recently there's been a big resurgence of civil society power and civil society, people clamoring for their rights. But I would argue that essentially we do have a democracy to some extent. We have the right to vote right now. When somebody wins in a landslide, they might actually get 20% of the eligible voters. If only 40% of your population votes, 21% of the people voting can elect your politicians. I would say there's no need for any kind of violent revolution. There's a need for civil society to step in, for civic education, and for people to vote. And then we can recapture the power we willingly gave up.
This is a related question also from the reading. Can you elaborate on what you mean exactly by a civil society, and how do we go about creating it?
Civil society, I would say, is right now, essentially we have government organizations, we have business, and we have this whole thing of, there's non-government organizations, there's people getting together. Civil society, to a large extent, is just people acting as citizens, knowing the issues, voting, and gathering to express their views. In other venues here in Vermont, you have your town meetings. You have people who, that's an example of civil society. They're not just acting as voters for government, they're going in and voicing their opinions and pressuring their politicians. But I would say a great example of global civil society, of positive globalization, is what happened, for example, in Seattle in 1999, where you had people from, there were the raging grannies, there were the young people, you had your blue-collar workers, all these people opposed to international trade and globalization and trade in the WTO framework, got together, exerted an enormous amount of pressure on the politicians, forced the issue to the public's attention. I'd say that was a great example of civil society. It's kind of a nebulous term, I suppose, but it's it's the source. It's something we all have the power to, as soon as we organize people.
This is a question from the audience. Landowners already pay for private property via property taxes, correct? why is this not enough?
What it is right now, landowners pay taxes on the buildings and on the land. And different distributions of it there. The building is something that is created by the sweat of your brow. If you have a building on your land, you actually created something there, you added to the value of the land, and we're taxing that right now. So right now you have, here in Burlington, if somebody has kind of run down student housing, if they fix that up to make it a better living space, they're going to pay higher taxes because the value of their property has gone up. That's a disincentive to improving the building. Slums are a great example of what happens when you tax buildings. So the value of the building is created by the individual. The value in the land you pay a tax on, but not that much of a tax. So that right now it's still a phenomenally good investment to buy idle land, do nothing with it, pay your taxes, and at the end sell it for far more than you paid. So as long as you are able to capture this value of produced by society, the tax on land is not high enough. So what they should be doing is shifting taxes from the improvements to the land itself, taxing not the value created by the individual, but the value created by society, and taxing it enough that you capture all that value. So there is no profit to be gained from speculating in land, from buying land, doing nothing with it, and gaining more money. As soon as you remove that speculative demand for land, that's a whole source of your demand for land goes down. When demand goes down, your price goes down, and it becomes more affordable. And this is just one more thing very quickly, that when we're talking about distribution, poor people spend, this is a point Gary Flo, a friend of mine, introduced to me, poor people spend an enormous amount of their income on housing. When you tax buildings, it's a disincentive to create more housing. When you tax land, it drives down the price of land, drives down creates incentive to create more housing, drives down the price of rent, and is another way of redistributing resources towards those who need them.
We had never read a lot about wealth cap versus consumption tax. In this one it was, is a policy such as maximum income possible in the U.S. where the hand of big business and large income executives washes the back of government politicians? Is a tax system on luxury goods, like our previous speaker suggested, more appropriate or realistic?
I would say, and this is from experience, that the idea, in my mind, one of the most important things is this limit the amount of wealth that you allow to accumulate. Right now, through most of Europe, there is a tax on wealth. I think in the Scandinavian countries, it's about 3% tax on wealth. That's not your income. That's your money in the bank. That's your property. Right now in the United States, we have a tax on wealth, and that's your house. So the one kind of wealth that most people own is taxed. The other stocks and bonds and wealth that the rich people alone own is not taxed. So we know from the fact that there is tax on land, there is a potential to go there. We know from the fact that it's happening in Europe that there is a potential to tax wealth, which is one way of going towards a maximum level of wealth. But I know from experience that one of the hardest points to sell is that there should be a limit to how much wealth people can have. People take it as a God-given right as an American that they can accumulate as much wealth as humanly possible, whereas that, I mean, it deprives future generations of options because more wealth means more consumption and less for the future. It distorts the distribution of power in favor of those who have wealth, so it's very, very difficult, and it requires, I mean, obviously, the interesting thing is that a maximum level of wealth would affect well under 1% of the population, would generate huge amounts of resources for everybody else, and yet people are totally opposed to it. In fact, people are in favor of these tax breaks for the, for the 1/2 of 1%. So it's, in a democracy, I have a hard time understanding why it's so complicated. I do recognize that it is very complicated, and I think a consumption tax might be, might be a little bit more feasible. But in any case, I mean, I do think that the basic issue is, as long as most Americans aren't voting, as long as we relinquish power to the wealthy, we're not going to go very far on towards any of these solutions.
This is another question from the audience. Do you feel that because Alaskans receive money for their oil, it encourages them to increase drilling? Alaskans want drilling in ANWR, so this program has not encouraged environmental protection, but maybe it has encouraged greediness.
Yeah, basically, I think that is an issue. And it's a problem, I think, on a national scale. I think what we should do is basically have a quota system where you decide based on the waste absorption capacity of the environment, based on our future needs, essentially how much oil could be drilled, and allow people to bid for the right to drill oil. That would actually drive up the price of oil. The more you produce, the lower your prices would be. So in this case, the less you produce, you know, it's a supply and demand. You have less oil available, price goes up. And that would stimulate a gradual, controlled increase in price, which would allow us to develop alternative technologies more at our leisure, instead of the current system where we're extracting the oil very, very fast until eventually demand will keep going up, supply won't be able to meet, and we're going to get a skyrocket in prices. But I do agree that right now the Alaskans, because they get profit from the oil, are more willing to dig it up. It's also a deal of diminishing marginal utility. Anybody who's been to Alaska knows that this is a state that is virtually entirely wilderness. They have a different attitude towards wilderness areas, towards preservation than everybody else, because the more you have of something, the less it's worth. Alaska is virtually entirely wilderness area.
This is another one from the reading. It's rather unique, but we thought we should ask it anyways. Wealthy people often go to psychiatrists and might be more receptive to controlling their expenditures and being philanthropic if an expert tells them that their quality of life will increase. The field of human psychology is very large. Do you think that has the potential to become a significant voice in the consumption versus quality of life debate?
I would actually say that psychologists are going to reach a very, very small number of people in terms of therapy. They're going to have a few individuals they're going to contact. Right now, the public relations industry hires psychologists at a huge scale to figure out how to doctor, how to manipulate, how to use media to make people want to consume more. So about $650+ billion a year are spent convincing people to buy profit-making consumer goods. And I don't know how much money a year is spent going to individual psychotherapists to be told the opposite. I think you're far more productive if you're imposing limits. And in my mind, advertising, I said that the quality of life in the reading is defined as your ability to satisfy your wants and needs. Advertising creates wants without creating any more ability to satisfy. Advertising, therefore, is a public bad. It makes people, it reduces quality of life. It has negative externalities. You tax the advertising or you demand truth in advertising, cut down the expenditures, essentially of psychologists trying to tell us we need to consume more to satisfy ourselves, is going to be more productive than having a few psychologists communicate to some that we should consume less.
From the audience as well. How do we measure the negative externalities? How do we put a price on rainforest or coral reefs, and who decides the price?
There's a lot of debate on this. What I argue is that every single thing produced by the economy requires resources from nature. So that means, and it generates waste. When you remove those resources, you degrade ecosystem function. When you spew out waste, you degrade ecosystem function. Every single product or economic process or economic action has a negative externality. So the reason we love the market to allocate things is because it requires everybody acting on their own individual knowledge, does what they want, and you come with this ideal outcome. If we want to put prices on all the ecosystem services, all the raw materials, it's going to require a centralized source of knowledge to gather all that information, do these complex studies, feed all that information back into the economic system so that the price system works again. But we love the price system because it doesn't require those things. So if we require those things to make the price system works, it's a little bit of a conflict. But the other issue is very clearly the current price for most of these things is zero. That is absolutely wrong. If you can educate people that these things have real solid prices, values, and the way I kind of look at it on a moral or scientific level is that we'd feel really weird putting dollar values on political rights or human rights. And I think a lot of these life support functions are in that realm of political right or human right more than they are in the terms of economics. So it's very difficult, but I do know the policymakers tend to want these dollar things. They want things boiled down to a simple a metric. I don't think we should always give them that. I think we should say you're actually making your choice between these complicated issues. But I do respect a lot of this work that is putting these dollar values on things because it sure captures the headlines and makes people aware these things have tremendous value. But I don't believe there's any one methodology that's going to give us the right number.
This is another one from the reading. Will developing nations be able to use the U.S. as an example and avoid the mess we have gotten ourselves into, going straight to a more sustainable society, or are they doomed to the same fate?
I would say right now it all depends where we go with this whole idea of globalization. Right now the idea is we're going to extend, the idea behind globalization is that markets, you can show mathematically that markets are extremely efficient, and they are, I will first admit, they're very, very efficient for narrow class of goods. Ecological economists say let's keep the markets efficient there and come up with other mechanisms for dealing with these classes of goods where they're not very efficient. A lot of the globalization advocates say let's extend the market, put dollar values on everything, extend the market everywhere, have the market make all the decisions for us. And so they're selling these developing countries that they have to do this free market model. And they're really forcing it on people that, right now, Jamaica, for example, had to, had tariffs on milk imports and subsidies for their farmers. The World Bank said, no, that's anti-market, you got to get rid of that. So now their entire dairy industry has collapsed because they're importing subsidized milk products from the European Union. So as long as people buy into this idea that America is the system that worked, communism failed, free market capitalism reigns supreme, that's the path we've got to go. And they're certainly not going to leapfrog. They're capturing some of our worst problems. The potential is there for this leapfrogging. But one of the big issues there is information. If you want to have free trade in something, if you want to have something available to everybody, it should be information. Zero cost to sending it around. If we develop these technologies that are very efficient sources of energy and produce very few negative externalities, very few greenhouse gases, that would be a fantastic thing. You spread that around the world, everybody benefits. The third world can avoid these problems of environmental destruction. But under the WTO, there's enforceable patents on those things for 20 years, and corporations will make the profits on it, and the knowledge won't be freely available. And you absolutely lose that option to leapfrog because poor people can't afford to buy these things. So there's, I would say that answer actually would want a lot more depth. But briefly speaking, I think that there's serious obstacles to leapfrogging, and they're being reinforced under globalization trends.
This is from the audience. How do you feel your perspective of distribution applies to the issue of water privatization?
Water privatization, that's a whole other topic I would get into. Water is one of these things. I think water is what they call, there's a very inelastic demand for water. Certainly at lower levels of water, a lot of poor people, when they have to pay for water, you need water. So no matter what the price of water is, you're going to pay for it. And certain goods like energy, water, food have that property. We saw in California, when there was a minor decrease in the supply of energy, massive fluctuations in price, massive skyrocketing in prices, creating enormous economic instability. So from a pure efficiency perspective, when you put prices on water, when you treat water as a commodity, so that poor people, a small diminution in supply leads to dramatic increases in price, it creates economic instability, so your economy doesn't thrive. And second, how many people have a source of more than one, the reason you want markets and things is because the competition drives down prices. When they're privatizing water, they're not creating competition, they're creating monopolies. There's nowhere they've privatized water that people have 50 different pipes running into their house and they can buy water from the pipe where it's cheapest. You're creating monopolies in water. Monopolies maximize profits for anything that's got an inelastic demand like water. You maximize profit by supplying as little as possible. So what you're doing is you're taking the water out of the public sector that ideally wants to provide the public good, putting it into the hands of the private sector in the form of a monopoly where their objective is to maximize profit. So even under the economist's own standards, this privatization of water is insane. And if you look at the actual outcomes, it's typically the worst case scenario. It was interesting. I was just in the Philippines and was talking to some woman about this environmental plan for this abandoned or U.S. military base, and it said there that they plan to privatize water. And I read over the plan. I said, "Geez, this is the one thing that really gets to me is that this usually has disastrous outcomes." He said, "Oh yeah, it did here too," and it's a bad idea.
This is one from the meeting. You brought up the idea that overdeveloped countries have incurred an ecological debt payable to less developed countries. Has anyone tried to calculate the dollar amount of this debt?
I'm not sure if anybody's actually tried to calculate the dollar amount. One way that's an interesting way you could try to let the market calculate it more or less is right now we have the Kyoto Protocol. We're trying to limit the amount of CO2 emissions. So that's one issue. You've got the scale issue. How much CO2 can the ecosystem absorb? Your second issue is your distribution issue. Who gets the right to emit? George Bush is arguing that, well, he's not arguing because he's not even in the Kyoto Protocol, but a lot of the rich countries say you should be grandfathered in. You should get the right to emit as much as you've emitted previously, which is essentially distributing to those who cause the damage. But if you looked at some kind of egalitarian approach, what you would say is, okay, over the past 200 years, this much has been emitted. This much could have been emitted. So if we allocated by countries according to essentially equally distributed the right to permit over 200 years, you would find that we've exceeded our quota by an enormous amount. And if we want to emit anything, we would have to pay the less developed countries for the right to emit. And you would essentially, if you distributed the right to pollute according to essentially an equal share of pollution emissions across the last 200 years, then the developed countries would have to pay enormous amounts to the underdeveloped countries, and that would, I'd say, be a reasonable approximation of the ecological debt for CO2 emissions anyway. I think that was I'm not sure if, probably be easier to explain that in more detail. I mean, it'd be easier with graphs and stuff to explain that idea in more detail, but it would, if you distribute it fairly over 200 years and then let the market figure out the price, that would be a reasonable estimate of ecological debt. I'm not, that you look like it didn't convey anything.
This is from the audience. Assuming that the poor have the same wants as the rich, if it were made so corporations had their government attention momentarily taken away and instead given to those stricken with poverty, what is keeping those in poverty from wanting more, growing, consuming, displacing, and making new corporations?
Absolutely nothing. And that's part of the reason that I think, most economists assume that preferences are given, that you're born with a set of preferences. And I think advertisers are betting $650 billion a year that they're wrong. I think it really is incumbent upon society to decide, what are sustainable outcomes and how can we make people want those sustainable outcomes. I think it's perfectly reasonable to try to, it's this big thing that the Nobel Prize was given last year to Joe Stiglitz for information asymmetry. He showed that the seller of a used car knows more about the used car than the buyer, and that leads to inefficiencies. I think a much bigger problem is information asymmetry in terms of how we're educated in terms of our preferences. This huge amount of money is spent convincing us that the only thing that will make us happy is more consumer goods. The reason that works is because you can make a profit advertising that fact. You can't make a profit advertising the fact that people benefit from ecosystem services and from strong communities and from all these other things. So there's this huge asymmetry in information flows affecting people's preferences. And we've got to, I think at the very least, we've got to, knock 90% down the flows of information telling us that consumption is the only way to satisfy our well-being, and have some other ways of, but I think under the current system, poor people often have very similar preferences to those of the rich. And especially when they're in very unequal distribution, they're always exposed through movies and TV and everything to the lives of the rich. That's what they decide they want.
Because we're running out of time, I'll ask one last question, which was rather popular from the readings. What can we as individuals do right now to start making a change?
I wouldn't say throw your TV out the window because that's polluting, but never turn it on would help. Actually, and I do think, I mean, the thing that we as individuals can really start doing is, first of all, you know, and I stress this, but just understanding what the issues are, acting on that understanding to vote for the right people, to campaign for the right people, to get involved in, when you don't think the politicians are doing it, getting involved with civil society, getting involved with NGOs who are working on the right issues, rethinking in terms of when you're looking for career choice. Right now, we live in a society where people estimate your worth by how much income you make, and that people buy into that too readily, and that you feel like you're inadequate unless you're making this huge income. Putting more emphasis on, you know, on the choice of what you're going to do with your life, looking at what makes you personally most happy, and not concerning about like what's going to make you the most money. And you know, this, I mean, that's, you know, this is one of the questions that you could go on for about 50 hours in an ethics course, but I think that's part of it. It's just, you know, in your own personal decisions about how you spend your money and how you spend your time, what you do with your life. Very, very vague, but.